rise for the procession and then remain standing until they're seated.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Warm welcome. Please take your seats. Professor Alex Broadbent, the Executive Dean of the Faculty of Humanities, Professor Natasha Erlank. We said 4 years?
4 years.
The day has arrived. No more ducking and diving. So, warm welcome to Natasha. A very warm welcome to our colleague Shireen, Professor Shireen Hassan from Wits University, who will be our respondent this evening. Senior leaders of the university, in particular I noticed the Deputy Vice Chancellor, Professor Anjana Parekh. Warm welcome, Anjana. Other senior leaders of the university, members of Senate who are present, and other academics, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Sani Bonani. Goeienaand, dames en heren. Tobela. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I want to, this evening, of course, extend a very special welcome to Natasha's loved ones who have turned out this evening to be part of this joyous occasion. A warm welcome to you, Mom. Yeah? A warm welcome also to your partner, Neil. And a warm welcome to the kiddies who have also joined us. Yeah. I asked them earlier, you sure you're going to be listening in or are you going to fall asleep? And the message was, I will be here, listening, observing. So warm welcome to you as well. And of course all of your loved ones and family, and of course your colleagues and friends who have all joined you for this occasion, this joyous occasion, I should say. As well. So it's indeed a great and honor and a special privilege for us to welcome you to the professorial inaugural lecture of our colleague, Professor Natasha Erlank. This is a very special occasion for her. It's a very special occasion for family and loved ones, indeed for her colleagues, all of us here at UJ in South Africa and beyond our borders. And so we extend a very warm welcome to each one of you to this proud and this joyful and this landmark moment for Professor Erlank and of course for all of us here at UJ. And please remember that, let me remind us that the title of Professor is a global title. It's the international title, it's international standard. And so we also, therefore, are joyous at this landmark moment for higher education beyond our borders. Excuse me. I was reminded not to do what I just did before I speak, because one of the colleagues who was speaking declined what I had just made use of. So apologies. And so inaugurations many a times we're told pompous and decadent, hopefully mostly dignified, well-meaning and unsullied. At least we're told date back in modern times to ancient Greece as the opportunity for the formal investiture of a person into high office. And it marks the formal assumption of the office. This is why we have the professorial inaugural lecture as close as possible to the appointment or the promotion of a colleague. You know, I don't have often opportunity to speak, so and so it therefore marks the formal assumption of the office or position of authority. I place emphasis on this because in modern day South Africa, the professor, the academic, seems to have a significantly lowly occupation in public life. And it seems to be diminishing by the day, as even the lowest ranked politician is elevated to a high status. And so even, yes, the very important role of the ward representative in the local authority, you will find that ward representative acknowledged, and the professors are simply ignored. And so I bring that contradiction to our attention because it reflects on the state of South Africa. It reflects on the assumptions that we walk around with, that indeed academics and the work that academics do, that this is important. And yet, as I suggest, even the lowliest or lowest ranked political office bearer is elevated in front of us. And so today therefore marks the rites of passage and the entry of Professor Erlank into the distinguished community of university's most senior scholars. And you can see I say this with great care, because she's already been in that community of the most senior scholars for the last 4 years or so. And so we will simply therefore put this delay to the fact that it was difficult to schedule this moment. And so, as I've suggested, this is an office and a position of authority and leadership which we shall not assume lightly, but shall do so with considerable and ongoing thought, reflection, deliberation and presence of mind. And so we shall observe Professor Erlank tonight with more than an ordinary level of interest, particularly since it is 4 years since her promotion. But also, of course, this is also an occasion to share with colleagues, to share with a community of scholars and with a wider community her own journey and her own work, and we will hear this evening about it when Professor Broadbent introduces Professor Erlank in a moment. And so on these auspicious occasions, I often, as I do this evening, remark on and remind us of Wouter Gregorian's hopefulness and indeed controversy when he announced to us that universities are not only repositories of past human endeavor, they are instruments of civilization. They provide tools for learning, for understanding and progress. They are the wellspring of action, a source of self-renewal, of intellectual growth and of hope. He continues, they're a medium of progress, of autonomy, of empowerment, of interdependence, and of self-determination. And yet at the same time I offer us Wernick's argument that the university has a contradictory relationship with its surrounding society. Dare I add, has become so evident in the last 24 months. On the one side, the autonomy in terms of its axial values of truth, of wisdom, of science and so on. And on the other side, he continues, those who control the means of material production control the means of mental production, and the dominant ideas are the ideas of those who dominate. And of the reflections of Professor Emmanuel Wallerstein, speaking some 4 years ago here at our Humanities lecture series, as he considered his own journey, and I quote, "It seems to me that it is the duty of the scholar to be politically and intellectually subversive of received truths." And he continues, "But the only way this subversion can be socially useful is if it reflects a serious attempt to change, shall I say, to engage apologies with, and to understand the real world as best as we can." I remind us that there are few books available in decent bookstores on what it is to be a professor, and in particular what the freedoms and duties of this most senior scholar of the university is maybe it's not a bad idea that there are few books, right? In this regard, I offer you the reflections of Bruce MacFarlane, who's a distinguished visiting professor here at the University of Johannesburg, who in his book Intellectual Leadership in Higher Education, Renewing the Role of the University Professor, seeks to respond to this oversight and argues, I believe, convincingly that given the corporatization of the research agenda, professors must reclaim professorial leadership, and that they thus occupy a very special and a crucial role. Specifically, MacFarlane argues that two freedoms, that of critic and advocate, are essential for professors to execute their four duties. You see the script. Yeah? Critic and advocate. These freedoms are essential for professors to execute the four duties, being that of mentor, of guardian of standards, of an enabler of networking and mobilizer of resources for others, and fourthly, of being an ambassador for the institution or discipline. And of course, also say this with great care, again, given the events of the last 24 months here in South Africa in particular. And so this evening we will have only one small insight into how Professor Erlank responds to this call for the return of professorial leadership. Allow me now to invite the Executive Dean, Professor Broadbent, to introduce Professor Erlank. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Vice-Chancellor, distinguished guests, may I add my welcome, in particular to the most important guests, who are Daniel and Ella, also to Dot and Neil, and then Dominique and Vanessa, I think are there. They are the sisters. This is a historic moment. I'm going to just say something briefly about Natasha, since my job is to read out what she has written. So let me just briefly add what I think. This is a historic moment, both because it's a historic moment at any inauguration, but in this case particularly because it celebrates a moment that occurred some time ago, as the Vice-Chancellor has emphasised repeatedly. Natasha is someone I regard as my senior. She's not getting off the hook for this, you see. I regard as my senior. I was sure she actually was a professor when I arrived here, but which was a very long time ago. But just to give you a flavour of the kind of colleague that Natasha is, the kind of senior colleague. I mean, she's a senior professor to me, whatever line management matters might say. Last week, I was in a sort of deanly tiz about something. Something wasn't going my way. I was annoyed, and I sent an irritated email, and I copied Natasha into it wrongly because she wasn't one of the people who was supposed to receive it. And then I got in a terrible mess, and I said, "I'm sorry. That wasn't meant for you. It was meant for somebody else," and so forth. And she wrote back with a one-liner, and she said, "Have a glass of wine." When Natasha began her university career in 1989 as an undergraduate majoring in English and Archaeology at the University of Cape Town, she little imagined that the university environment would inspire her so much, or that she would so enjoy teaching undergraduates, that she would still be at university almost 30 years later. After completing her MA at UCT, she enrolled for a PhD at Cambridge, which she completed in early 1999, the year she began working at the Rand Afrikaans University. She has remained at the university since, including during the period in the mid-2000s, when the university merged with several other institutions to become the University of Johannesburg. At the university, she's always participated widely in both formal and informal research activities, the former visible in the range and extent of her publications. She sees her academic role extending beyond research to encompass matters of concern to the university and a broader academic context, for instance, issues around academic freedom, staff and student rights. As a teacher, she is committed to an open-minded and ever-learning process of engagement with students. Good teaching and student success require the cultivation of respectful and mutually engaging relationships. As a researcher, she has always had Catholic interests with a small c. And an interest in research, Catholic with a small c is a word which you can look up. It means something very specific. Research practice and historical theory. With respect to the latter, I would call she would call herself a feminist historian, and her interest in gender has led her into careful contemplation on the inequalities of power that structure all human relationships. In South Africa, this means that any attention to gender is always attention to race as well as to other inequalities. Over the last decade, her research focus has pulled in two directions. In the first, in a continuation of themes which have preoccupied her since the late 90s, she has worked on African Christianity, gender and tradition in the first part of the 20th century, examining how black Christians, who consider themselves to be thoroughly modern, and new Africans, the phrase in use in the 1920s and 30s, thought about and acted on issues to do with traditional practice, especially those related to gender. This includes femininity, masculinity, sexuality, and marriage and family life. In the next year, she is planning to publish a monograph on this subject entitled Gender, Christianity and Tradition in South Africa in the Early 20th Century. She has worked principally on southern Africa, but her future research trajectory includes examining similar issues across the African continent. She's published in the South African Historical Journal, Gender and History, Feminist Studies, African Studies Review, and the journal Southern African Studies. An early research interest included African men's sexuality and masculinity. Her ongoing concern with sexuality and masculinity has continued to date. In further work on Christianity, she looks at how interest in protecting customary practice formed a point of unity for black Christians across Africa. Here, her work is explicitly transnational. Professor Erlank's interest in black Christianity has led her into work on the politics of African nationalism in South Africa. In 2005, she wrote a paper on ANC positions on gender, reflecting on 10 years of gender gains and losses. In 2012, her interest in the politics of nationalism led her to collaborate with a group of scholars interested in reflecting on ANC history. The result was a jointly edited volume, 100 Years of ANC, Debating Liberation Histories Today. The volume is a serious and considered intervention into debates around ANC historiography in the year of the party's centenary. As a publicly engaged historian, she is concerned with the contemporary politics of memory in South Africa, a research interest aligning with debates about public history. While some of her interest in this regard is expressed in research, she has also acted as a consultant on public history and memory projects in South Africa. In 2009, together with colleagues, she initiated a project into the history of Sophiatown, the iconic suburb adjacent to the University of Johannesburg. The project required her and her colleagues to work closely with residents as part of a larger community development project with history at its core. In 2015, she edited a special issue of African Studies with her colleague, Dr. Carrie Morgan, which represents the fruit of this research. The work has also resulted in a volume of popular history. As part of her work into Christian modernities in South Africa, she has spent much time reading copies of African newspapers published in the first half of the 20th century. This work constitutes some of her new research, including into the weekly Umtilele Wabantu. She is hoping to find time in the next 2 years to write a monograph on the history of this fascinating newspaper. She's currently involved in two international research projects, one on gendering intimacies, the Gendering Intimacies Project, a Mellon-funded project under Professor Shireen Hassim, who is here tonight. And she's also collaborating with Dr. Joel Cabrita at the University of Cambridge on a project entitled New Histories of South African Christianity. It is my immense pleasure to, before having a glass of wine, invite Professor Erlank to address us. Thank you.
In the interest of conserving paper, I printed my speech on the back of something else, so hopefully I read the correct presentation. Good evening. Vice-Chancellor, thank you very much for those very kind words, and Mr. Dean, thank you very much for your introduction, and some of you asked me earlier why I wasn't having a glass of wine, and I said I would be as soon as this presentation was finished. So thank you for that concern in that regard. And to everyone else here, Prof Parak, thank you very much for coming, and thank you very much for being here with me this evening. As a historian, it is my privilege to begin tonight with those who have gone before me. Many of you in the audience have helped me to become the scholar that I am today. To my mother and to my sisters, I am grateful for your love and your support. Neil, thank you for many things, including our two lovely children. Daniel and Ella, that's you. And I wanted to make a special thank you, say a special thank you to Mrs. Sibonisiwe Moyo, who is my children's second mother and who keeps the family running. Sibo, I don't know where we would be without you, so thank you very much. There are so many people here that I could thank, so if I skip over you, many apologies. To my department and to my colleagues, thank you for being as excited by the project of history and about shaping lives as I am. But thank you, too, for being tough and rigorous when I've needed it. To Widgiewick and the Spice Girls, you know who you are. And it is to you that I give all the credit for the good bits of my work. The rest of my work is entirely up to me. And finally, to my students, and there's several of them here this evening. There are also other students from historical studies here. You're the reason why most of us actually stick with this job. You heard Professor Rensburg talking about the fact that ward councillors get more recognition than professors. We do get recognition, and it's from you that we get the kind of recognition that keeps us going. So I wish you the courage of your convictions, and I hope to see you on the other side of your current degrees as colleagues one day sharing a glass of wine at a conference. Thank you.
Love you, Prof.
If, like my children, you've brought a tablet or a smartphone along to play Minecraft during my presentation, I'm going to give you a short version of my paper. I'm going to be speaking about the emergence of a type of black masculinity in the 1910s and 1920s, one which was distinctly modern and profoundly Christian at the same time. These men were the Christian moderns of my paper's title. In all the current attention that is given to African masculinity, and it would be difficult to lose sight of the fact that understandings of masculinity are deeply implicated in this nation's current predicaments, we should not lose sight of the fact that current and hegemonic ways of being a man are both a product of their time, and that these do not follow seamlessly, necessarily, from the kinds of masculinities practiced in the past. I am, of course, though, because it's my prerogative tonight, going to begin my presentation in two different places. First, I'm going to speak about the practice of being a historian, and secondly, I'm going to speak to you not about African men, but about African women. It may sound redundant to say that historians have a keen appreciation of the past. Most of the historians I know balance a keen awareness for who they are and where they come from with the kinds of history they do and the questions they ask of the archives in which they work. To quote one of my favorite historians, Carolyn Steedman, as might be expected of an experience that is an important professional rite of passage, no one historian's archive is ever quite like another's. Each account of his or her experiences within them will always produce counter-narratives of different kinds of discomfort. And the slide on the screen at the moment, the arrow is pointing to a gentleman with big ears who is my late father. He was a first-generation student at UCT in the late 1950s, a geochemist, and perhaps it was all his talk of the past and of the Earth's great age which made me first become interested in what has gone before. That's probably why I started off as an archaeologist and only later made the switch to being an historian. I should also say it's immensely easy when you're the second-generation child of parents who've attended university to navigate waters that are at university, and I'm profoundly grateful for that. It certainly makes a difference to the kind of experience one has. The next slide is of my mum, which I found on the internet. So my mother has played a pivotally important role in my life. And I wanted to speak to her now, Mom, not as you yourself, but rather about the fact that you actually have become part of the archive. So this is a slide from a Black Sash collection at UCT. You can access it online. And it has the rather odd title of Erlank and AMP, the coffee machine. This was at a Black Sash National Conference in 1989. But lest you think that's your only presence in the archive, I found another reference to you. So you probably can't see this, but over here this is for some of you who know the Wits Historical Papers collection, you'll recognize the format. This is the online catalogue from one of the collections at Wits Historical Papers, our neighbours just down the road. And here is item D38.2.6, which says Black Sash, Western Cape Region and Wage-Earning Women by Dot Erlank, Josie Frater, Rosemary Maney Gibbett, and Berger Thomas. So all of us at various points in our lives can inhabit different statuses. Sometimes we are of the archive, sometimes we address the archive. And it's often difficult to disentangle those two roles. So I'm tremendously grateful and fortunate in having parents who inspired me to read and to think, and who inspired me with evidence of their own social conscience. It is thoughts of the archive that connect with what I have just said to my next point. As a historian, I am gripped, and I know that many of you in this room are too, by what Carolyn Steedman calls archival fever, and thoughts about archives, whether they're going to shut too soon for you to be able to finish consulting the material, whether you'll have a sufficient chance to actually look at the documents, or whether they'll be too destroyed by the dust of their disintegration to be able to read them. These kinds of thoughts preoccupy historians. And in the broadest sense of the term, archives are produced and preserved, and they run on through in my head in the kinds of work that I do. So that's why I'm simultaneously able to reflect on where I come from, part of my own history, my counter-narrative, but also the narratives of the kinds of historical subjects that I research. Now I'm going to come on to the next point that doesn't have anything to do with the subject of my paper today. As a young undergraduate, I was taken by a very important paper on the importance of doing gender in South Africa. The paper's title was a bit on the side, Gender Struggles in the Politics of Transformation in South Africa, by Joe Beale, Alison Todis, and Shireen Hassan. Reading papers like this one marked a future research path into histories of women and gender for me, something that has characterized some of my earlier work, but not so much recently. In order to explain why a feminist historian ended up studying men, let me use a more contemporary example, or rather an example of my contemporary research. For some years now, I have been tracking down the archival traces of a woman called Dorothy Kabani. I first came across her in the magisterial court records of King William's Town in 1934. She had taken a lover to court for breach of promise and seduction, a case which, unlike many at the time, she won. I subsequently came across a report of her 1938 wedding to another man in the black newspaper Umtheteli Wabantu. The first slide that I showed you is the picture that was on the invitation to this event, and it's the editorial of Umtheteli Wabantu in 1930. So if you picture those gentlemen, you have a very good idea of what the newspaper was about. About a week or so ago, when I was in the archive in Cape Town, which shut early because they were fumigating, I read her evidence in an application she brought in front of the Cape and Free State Division of the Native Appeal Course. She had been motivated, she said, to seek a divorce because of her husband's unfaithfulness. Now, many scholars of South African history, many scholars of gender, or indeed feminist historians, will tell you how difficult it is to find African women in the historical record before a period beginning around the 1950s. This is not a comment about the activities of black women or even about their public roles, but rather about the lack of archival trace, written, oral, and otherwise, which chart their activities. Writing by African women is rare compared with that of African men, and if we look, for instance, at African writers in the 1950s, men by far outnumber the women who had their work published. If you're wondering why I'm beginning here, and I still haven't gotten to the beginning of my paper, with Dorothy, and perhaps I was drawn to her because she shares a name with my mother, I'm trying to reflect on a frustration I feel as a scholar of the late 19th and early 20th century in writing histories of African women. It is also a frustration which recognizes the deep psychological trauma that an archive can reflect. I only know so much about Dorothy because she enters the archival record, the historical record, not because anyone thought it was worthwhile to preserve traces of her, but at points of deep sadness in her life, which are then rendered up for public scrutiny by the impersonal processes of what was first South Africa before 1948, and then the apartheid state. We only know about her because she's in court records. The greatest repository of written content which chronicles black South African women's lives before the 1950s are court records, both criminal and civil. And this is a pretty sad thing. So despite a career in which I always intended to write about the gendered struggles of women in South African history, I've ended up trying to understand the gendered lives of men, especially black Christian men. In the almost decade and a half I've been working on this subject, it has become clear to me that it is impossible to understand what motivated and drove educated African men in the interwar period without paying serious attention to how they understood and aspired to modernity, a modernity that was closely linked to their own Christianity. Although modernity as a concept has received much discrediting over the last decade or so, it is clear that in the early 20th century, the African elite, and by this I mean mission-educated men and women, set great store by the concept. Educated African men and women aspired to a modern lifestyle in ways that were both tangible, fiercely expressed, and fiercely defended. In this address, my concern is specifically with African men who considered themselves to be not only modern, but Christian moderns. For these men, their faith was inseparable from their status as teachers, printers, writers, clerks, translators, and the other means through which African men gained a financial foothold in the world of the white. What it meant to be modern, though, was not the same for men and women, just as it was not the same for all Africans. Because of the premium that African men placed on literacy and on being good citizens, their concerns around their status as Christian men often played out in public, firstly in associational activities like literary and debating societies, like Christian organizations, and also, that is 4 to 5, a significant number of these men in their political activities as African nationalists. All right, so this is where my paper was supposed to begin. And Shireen, I think you've seen a version that only starts here, so apologies for the stuff that I added in subsequent to sending you a copy. In 2003, I published a paper in the journal Feminist Studies, the front page of which you can see on the screen. As you will see shortly, I could hardly miss the importance these men placed on their status as men. In the paper, I attempted to account for the greater absence than might have been expected of women in nationalist activity before 1950. If one reads through many of the public statements from senior ANC leaders and other prominent male nationalists, it is striking to note how often they speak in terms of a denied or frustrated manhood, the inability to become fully men because they were denied full voting rights and equal status with white men in the body politic. I'm skipping over that one because it's going to take me too long to cue it to play to you. That was supposed to be a slide of Jacob Zuma singing Umshimi Wam in order to illustrate to you the contemporary importance of the politics of a militarized masculinity. But instead we're going to go to Zacchaeus Mahabane, who was a predecessor of Jacob Zuma, though a long time ago, and a minister in a mainline church rather than an African independent church. Within Mahabane's words, which you can see on the screen, we find some ideas about what it is that African nationalists understood about what it means to be a man. If male adulthood involved a relationship with the body politic, the white South African state, through its discriminatory and racist policies, had denied male-gendered Africans the ability to be fully men. I begin with this paper because, as I was preparing for this inaugural, I realized that my comments made over a decade ago about the relationship between masculinity and public life in South Africa are possibly even more true today than they were then. This nation is in the grips of a crisis rooted not only in ideas about race, but also in ideas about gendered power relations. This is exemplified, on the one hand, by high levels of sexual violence against women, and on the other, by the public promotion of what some refer to as a militarized masculinity. A form of masculinity which glorifies certain kinds of violence and masculine authority over, importantly, younger men and women. I think we sometimes don't pay enough attention to the generational politics of current gender struggles. I don't have time this evening to detail the careful links that need to be established in order to make these kinds of assertions, but these issues have been written about by many, including some in this room tonight. And some of the people that I could refer you to, for instance, include Shireen Hassim, Liz Gunner, where are you sitting, has written very importantly also about Umshimi Wam and the politics of soft masculinity. What much of the scholarship makes clear is that the roots of contemporary practice lie in the past, though not in any uncomplicated fashion. Historians are always going on about how complicated the past is. I think that might be something that's particular to us, which other people don't understand. A complete history of South African masculinities in the 20th century would have to chart why some masculinities succeeded and why others failed, why some flourished in intimate spaces, as well as the relationship of these kinds of spaces to the kinds of masculine politics that play out today in public. This state of affairs, however, is not a logical outcome of anything in this country's past. I wish to stress this because one of the benefits of history is to show that change does occur. In fact, it's probably one of the most inspiring things about doing history. Indeed, that change occurs more often than not, and learning to identify that change is one of the skills of the historian. In the rest of my presentation, I'm going to describe some of the features of the masculinity that emerged amongst second-generation converts to Christianity in South Africa in the early 20th century. I've been teaching the students all week about the difference between the 19th century and the 1900s, and here I am making that self-same mistake myself, and which constitutes an explicitly Christian modernity in the face of a racist and discriminatory white state. I'm trying to make the point that, even as recently as the 1920s, the kind of violent masculinity that often seems to reign today in public affairs was not a foregone conclusion. In the interwar period, some African men eagerly crafted Christianity to more traditional ideas about masculinity in order to create a link with the past that, at the same time, was suitably modern. In order to craft this masculinity, they drew, if I can call it that, on a repertoire of behaviors that were deeply steeped in the value of literacy and in the importance of Christianity. I should add that these behaviors, when articulated as a set of political goals, drove the African nationalist agendas I wrote about in the slide that I showed you previously. I want to begin then with black Christian debates about the practice of what is now referred to. This is what historians have to do. We keep having to say things like, this practice is now referred to as X, but then it was referred to as Y. The artist formerly known as. So, I begin with black Christian debates about the practice of TMCI, or what is often referred to as circumcision, amongst Christian Africans in the early 20th century. and what follows is largely the text of what you see in front of you tonight, in the very nice pamphlet that the university handed out. In 1920, the launch of the weekly Umtateliwa Bantu, which became, for a time, South Africa's most widely distributed black newspaper, provided a national space for the discussion of traditional initiation. In an early correspondence initiated in February 1922 and lasting until October, the subject of circumcision was tracked through at least 12 letters. Letters cross-referenced each other, with authors listing addresses from Kimberley to Umtata to Petersburg. If I can just say one thing to try and represent to you the urbanity of the kind of audience participating in this debate. Even men who would have been home language speaking Sesotho speakers or Tswana speakers participated in the debate in Xhosa. This was the first in a series of letter-based debates in Umtateli over the next 2 decades, linked either directly to circumcision or to circumcision as custom. I think the second quote on the slide in front of you has to be one of my favorite historical quotes of all time. I hope you can see why. In February 1922, Moses Bandela wrote a letter from Nansfield. Nansfield is pretty much where Chris Hani Baragwanath is today, outside Johannesburg. His letter described a meeting he had called to promote the revival of Xhosa manhood initiation. I called this meeting to look into ways of encouraging the AmaXhosa to go back to their roots, especially their first and foremost custom, which was practiced by their forefathers. His anxiety about loss of roots was palpable and helped to establish one of the threads in the letters that followed. In March, Umboneli Wezinto agreed, calling for greater investigation into the origins of the decay of this most important custom. Moses Bandela's letter advocated the circumcision of grown men because of what he viewed as the negative consequences of boyish behavior. When a Xhosa boy is past circumcision age, no good can come from him. This has created problems because a boy remains a boy even when he tries to be a leader. This was not an isolated incident. Mr. Bandela was referring to the circumcising of old boys in East London, where a group of men past the age, the traditional age of circumcision, had been taken off against their will. In fact, some of you may remember that Fikile Mbalula was kidnapped for exactly the same reason in 2008. That was an active discipline. Mr. Bandela was suggesting a serious intervention. His comments reveal a combination of anxieties around masculinity and authority, linked specifically to being Xhosa. XYZ, who viewed circumcision as anti-Christian, picked up the debate in 2 very lengthy letters. He described how some churches were promoting immoral behavior because they advocated circumcision. He challenged the view that educated Xhosa needed to be circumcised in order to be considered men. And he wrote, "Back in the land of the AmaXhosa, it has been accepted that the educated and the Christians do not circumcise. Many of them have been fighting and maintaining that they will not circumcise. That battle is still being fought today, and we are told to go back to our traditions, which is against the word of God." That's not what I wanted to show you. There we go. His writing was, at heart, a comparison of 2 understandings of masculinity. In the first, circumcision was the route to manhood. In the second, Christian moral behavior was sufficient to secure the status of being a man. If his Xhosa readers disagreed, the rest of the readers did not necessarily agree themselves. Most who wrote to the newspaper on the subject were quite satisfied that circumcision was neither unchristian nor outmoded as a route to manhood. In opposition to a concerted white missionary attempt to stamp out circumcision, its practitioners brought it carefully into the fold of Christianity. And any of you who know your Bibles will think immediately of some of the passages where the circumcision of young boys is advocated. As one contributor wrote, "We learn about circumcision in the Bible because this is the commandment that was given to the Jews by God. That alone indicates that circumcision is not a sin, because God would never have led his people into sin." Umboneli Wezinto noted parallels between traditional practice, like the anointing of initiates, and what happened in the Bible. In fact, he drew a direct analogy between the 10 Commandments and the advice given to initiates by their guardians. He described circumcision as a sacrament. And again, any of you who are up on your Anglican theology will understand the importance of describing something as a sacrament rather than just as a church-based practice. Some of these views were reflected in more lengthy publications. James Kalata, both Anglican minister and ANC member, reflected common thinking on circumcision, first citing a genealogy rooted in Solomon's links with Abyssinia, then quoting Joshua, and finally Genesis. He concluded, in fact, that this custom of circumcision is an African one. His and others' work emphasized Africa's ancient connection to Christianity, placing circumcision parenthetically into the pool of biblical references to Africa, most famously Psalm 68:3. The 1922 exchange also reveals, and don't worry, I'm getting to the end of this now. You've been very patient, children. The 1922 exchange also reveals how men were moving back and forth between meetings, church gatherings, and the newspaper in their arguments and conversations. So the newspaper debate tells us that the same subjects were being debated in public. Letters referred specifically to the public nature of the debate, from men who were equally comfortable in English, in Xhosa, or in Sesotho or Setswana. What is noticeable is that everyone is talking about it in Johannesburg. It sounds a bit like a gossip column from a contemporary newspaper. It is such a heated topic that even those who have not been circumcised say they support circumcision because, without it, children become troublesome. Troublesome, of course, was a shorthand for disrespect and moral laxity. Isn't it wonderful? Historians get to use outdated phrases like moral laxity that many of you who work in more contemporary periods don't get to use because an editor on a journal would throw it out instantly. The same month, Mr. Maimane, not the current one, in a report on the Pretoria Diocesan Native Conference, referred to circumcision as, and I start the quote, one of the most important subjects discussed. In September, when the editors closed the correspondence, interest in the subject was still very high. So what happens is the editors said, sorry, we're not going to publish any more letters on the subject. In 1928 and 1929, Umteteli again carried several letters on circumcision, and in fact the debate pops up again in the 1930s and into the 1940s. And the letters again were also in Xhosa. As in the previous exchange, writers eagerly followed and responded to the arguments of their predecessors. It's a bit like academic writing, you know, when they say, as my learned colleague said. So that's what you get in these newspapers. While the tactics, however, that they used marked the start of a very important shift, a shift away from exclusive use of Xhosa into English as well. She argues that the society acted as a leadership forum for an aspiring African elite. Working creatively with debate form and content, these pupils challenged the terms of a white intellectual imperialism. These newspaper debates constitute a counterpart to this argument, but to a much wider audience. Through newspaper debate, African men brought into existence a complex and multidimensional interpretive community. Isabel, you write so wonderfully, thank you, where circumcision leveraged entry into broader discussions about the value of custom, Christianity, and the relationship of both to white assertions of civilizational superiority. In doing so, they performed a Christian modernity. Okay, and then obviously I knew that I would write far too much, so I'm skipping through to the last paragraph. And I am going to say, in 2003, when I wrote the paper in Feminist Studies, I explained that it was the inability to maintain a respectable lifestyle which drove many African men into anti-state politics, into African nationalist politics. when men of the African middle class could no longer play cricket of a progressive kind, it's a quote from some other work I've done, they used their aspiration to craft a nationalist politics. The critical importance of being allowed to function as an adult man, to look after one's family, to have one's voice listened to, these were all the things that the Reverend Mahabani chronicled in the quotes that were on the screen earlier. Mahabani, who was a Wesleyan minister, was keenly aware of the inability of Christian men to maintain their own families, and he used this imagery as a goad to encourage other men to join in the activities of, firstly, the ANC, and later on, other organizations like the All African Convention. By the 1950s, however, the perhaps genteel masculinity to which these men aspired had become impossible for a variety of reasons. And I'm just skipping forward to something else because I think that this little news briefing captures it all. Today, other masculinities, one which valorized warriors instead of herd boys, are more dominant. In his recent book, Kapana Ratele has spoken about the need for masculinities liberated from the kind of militarized discourses I have referred to. I hope that my work has shown, through reference to different masculinities in the past, that this is indeed possible. Thank you very much.
Enormously wonderful for me to be speaking at Natasha's inaugural. Our relationship goes back a long way. I was going to say that that paper that she references was first written for a seminar, the feminism seminar at Wits University, but of course, being a historian, she trumped me with an even earlier reference to an intellectual engagement. So thank you, Professor van Rensburg, Professor Broadbent, for inviting me to do this. So Natasha's work addresses all the themes that my parents told me were not suitable for discussion in polite society: sex, religion, and politics. Even as you saw, a cursory reading of her publications turned up for me the following list of words: seduction, deceit, revulsion, illicit, immoral, impure, touch, penetration, sexual transgression, breasts, penis. Apparently, fornication, this is a quote from one of your papers, Natasha, fornication was the bread and butter of the church. Well, let me not say more. There are children present, and you get the drift. More seriously, I did, in fact, reread large parts of Natasha's work for this event, and I had ringing in my head as I read it the now commonplace critique that is being made of white historians in South Africa, that all history of South Africa is simply the story of black lives read through a privileged colonial narrative. I had in mind also other discussions that are circulating in our circles, the ready dismissal of feminism as something deeply and inextricably implicated in whiteness. How startling it would be to a student versed in the language of decoloniality, then, to find in the work of this white feminist the very critiques of coloniality that are assumed to be definitive of South African historiography. Now, I'm only being slightly mischievous here because I do have a purpose to this, to pointing out this irony. I personally am not dismissive of the notion of decoloniality, as it stands for a renewal of a focus on how subjects and subjectivities come into being, and indeed for a renewed interest in historical analysis. Maybe that's decoloniality light, but that's the version that I think is useful. Reading Natasha's work, one sees how attuned she is to the idea that subjectivities are being forged in a complex and particular matrix of power, in which all protagonists have some, not necessarily equal, of course, constitutive power. That furthermore, states and nations are made not only in the crucible of political struggle in the public sphere, but in the messy relationships of the private and the social. Starting with the church and with missionaries, where all good tales of sex start, I guess. Natasha argues that Christianity was more than simply a beachhead for political overlordship. Rather, or additionally, she argues, Christianity incorporated African people into the customs and social practices of Europeanity, which is a clumsy sort of word, just like decoloniality. The particular variant of modernity in which this supposed model of the heteropatriarchal family, with its attendant bricolage of morality, its codes of affection and disgust, its certainty, and its nationalist liberatory promise, was one that was not a fixed model simply imposed, simply applied, but rather one that was made historically in conflictual and by no means self-evident or teleological fashion. Europeanity was not simply imposed, her work shows, it was not simply acquiesced to, and not even simply resisted. Through various narratives of lives of Africans in the 19th and 20th centuries, expressed in the cold, hard terms of legal injunctions and court cases, as well as the intimate and sentimental fragments of love letters and appeals to social authorities through stories of seduction, thwarted love, abandonment, of hopes and dreams ardently expressed, she shows us how some Africans adopted Christianity for what they could invest in it spiritually and materially. So too with colonial law and the state, not only and not merely the instruments of repression, but also resources to be mobilized when justice was thwarted. In her work on white weddings, Natasha draws us into worlds in which constrained spaces for kinship and sociality are transcended through particular visibilized processes of recreating social status. She shows, of course, that it is not without its attendant problems of heteronormativity and incorporation into mediatized consumption, some of which she painstakingly details the costs of. Yet what her work shows is that subjects being formed in this process are neither invisible nor passive, though indeed they are making history in conditions that are not of their own choosing. That moreover the nations and communities forged in these processes, the registers that emerge of inclusion and citizenship, are deeply inflected by ideas of love, care, and solidarity. And that they are made, as we heard this evening, by marking the body in many senses, marking the feminine reproductive body as the site of control of a lineage, the female sexual body as the object of sexual fantasy, the male body as the object of contestation over how authority was to be established. In this inaugural, Natasha returned to an earlier theme in her work, that of political masculinities, and I will say, yes, first presented at the Wits Feminism Seminar, and since then one of her most cited papers. Here in this paper is the golden thread, I think, between the social and the political, in which she shows so compellingly how to be a fully fledged rights-bearing citizen in a country that denied the very humanity of black people met with the response that personhood and status would be crafted in the notion of sociality and in the notion of masculinity. For many black men, she shows, masculine identities were shaped around notions of care, respect, and respectability, and even imbued with playfulness. Of course, being Natasha, such lofty, worthy ideas are explored through a study of circumcision. Here she herself is transgressive in opening up a conversation that is seen to be out of bounds for black women, let alone white feminists. But indeed, feminists are now weighing in, as they do, on the issue of all forms of cutting of bodies. Natasha's argument, which we've just heard, is that violent masculinities were not inevitable outcomes of our wretched history, nor are they definitive of black sexualities and black masculinities. Her account tells us about the place that circumcision occupied in the marking of male adulthood, very deliberate and rational discussions about how this would happen, and in notions of strength and power. I have to say, I'm left, as usual with your writing, intrigued and also wanting more. wanting a hint of where and when the rupture takes place, under what conditions new and violent masculinities are constructed. Because, as your work suggests, Natasha, there is much at stake here. You talked about the film Wounded, which is addressing the conditions under which male authority is defined in the present, the high cost of mutilation, death no less, the violence done to men by men. Wounded is also a conversation led by men, but the arrival of public conversation is indebted to the interventions of black feminists and white feminists, particularly black feminists, I think. Their refusal of their exile from matters to do with the bodies of their male kin. I was struck by the similarities in what you were writing about with feminist work on the violent construction of heterofemininities, the forcible marking of gendered status and identity through practices ranging from forced breeding and forced sterilization all the way through to the contemporary beauty industry. And I wonder whether the entire approach, yours, mine, all of ours, our entire approach to the making of gendered subjectivities needs to proceed more systematically from and through a common archive of concepts that enables us to see more clearly the ways in which gender, modern, traditional, post-colonial, all of its forms, is constituted through violence on all bodies. Here, I think, is where we cannot escape confronting the other aspect of modernity. We've dealt with, I think, the much critiqued aspects of modernity, but there is this other aspect of modernity, its mechanisms of repair through rights, its promise that another way of being in our bodies must be possible. But there, I know, Natasha, you will respond that you are a historian, not a political theorist, but I look forward to these engagements and I congratulate you enormously on this great achievement. Thank you.
So there we have it, family and colleagues and friends. Of course, I had more than a ordinary interest in this conversation, being the father of a Xhosa boy who just 3 years ago went through the process of what is the word? Of becoming a man in this particular manner. And I invited also my local priest, who is a Xhosa man from Oudtshoorn. And I thought that he would find it interesting, especially since he's searching for a supervisor for his master's studies. So I think there you had it. There we've all heard it. The proposition that the professor is the guardian of standards, the idea that the professor is, amidst the contradiction, the ambassador for her discipline and for the institution. And I can go down that list, and I'm certain that we all will have ticked those boxes, isn't it? And we're not asking for a vote this evening. It's already done. And I just want to say what a great honor it is, what a great privilege it is for us to have Natasha on, the most senior of our academic staff community here at the University of Johannesburg. And before I go any further, please, Shireen, please accept our sincere appreciation. Professor Hassan, can we give another round of applause? Not the first time that you find yourself in this room, so we're really grateful and always honored to have you here. Thank you so much for taking the time to review again the work and to respond in the manner that you were able to this evening. We're really honored and appreciative. So I think on that note, on that affirmatory note of Professor Erlank's accomplishments and of her wonderful treatise of the subject this evening, I want to invite her and the Dean and Shireen and also Professor Parek, if you want to do the honors, please.
There's more. That way. There's more.
Wow. Take a bow. So please join us for refreshments as part of the celebration.